The coronal spire of Sesefandar was not a palace in any sense a human would have recognized, and that misunderstanding had killed more visiting dignitaries than any weapon the court kept on display. It was grown, not built, a single helical column of living chitin and fused silicate that rose 400 meters from the salt plain and breathed in slow tidal pulses, each exhalation a low harmonic that the resident species, the Vale, used the way other cultures use the position of the sun. The spire was a calendar, a throne, a lung, and a court of law all at once, and it had been the seat of the luminous Concordat for 940 cycles, and in all that time it had admitted exactly one human, and it had admitted him by accident, and it intended to correct the accident before the next high tide. The corridors warmed and cooled in waves that meant things. The light came up through the floor in grated bands of teal and pale violet, brightening when the court approved and dimming to a bruised indigo when it did not. And a creature who could not read those bands was, in the most literal architectural sense, blind. The Vial had built a world in which fluency was survival, and a foreigner was, by definition, drowning. Into this column of breathing stone, they had brought a man who repaired ventilation systems for a living, and they had assigned him the bureaucratic designation of provisional atmospheric technician, third tier, non-citizen, and they had expected him to last 9 days. He had lasted 40. That was the problem the court had convened to solve. His name was Daniel Reyes, and he was not impressive in the way the Vial understood impressiveness, which was to say, he did not glow, did not loom, did not modulate his skin to signal rank, and did not carry himself as though the air owed him passage. He was of medium height by his own species, and small by the standards of the hall, where the average courtier stood a clean head taller and trailed luminous filaments from the crown like a slow banner. He wore a brown work jacket gone pale at the elbows from years of bracing against metal, and he kept his hands visible and still, and he watched everything with the patient, unhurried attention of a man checking a pressure gauge he did not trust. He did not look frightened in the spire, which the Vial found unsettling, because everyone was frightened in the spire, and fear was the medium through which the court conducted its business. He did not look defiant either. He looked to the courtiers who studied him through the warm, cool gradient of the hall light, like a man who had been called to a job site and was waiting to be told which panel had failed. The court read this as ignorance. It was not ignorance. It was the absence of a thing they had assumed was universal, and that absence was about to cost a great many of them a great deal. The figure who had arranged for Daniel to be in the spire at all, and who now most wished him gone, was the Concordat's master of internal climate, an elder courtier named Vashorin Tay. Vashorin was old even by Vale measure, his filaments thinned to silver threads, his skin a cooled lavender that no longer flushed easily, and he held the single most important office no outsider understood the importance of. Every drop of breathable air in the spire passed through systems Vashorin controlled. He set the harmonic of the great lung. He certified the scrubber towers. He signed, in the pulsed glyph language of the court, the atmospheric integrity reports that let the Concordat sleep in their grown stone without suffocating in their own exhalations. Vashorin Tay was, in the polite fiction of the court, a guardian. In private, he was something else, and the something else was the reason a human ventilation technician had been pulled from a refit crew on a freight platform and installed in the most fluency-dependent building in the system. Vashorin had been falsifying the integrity reports for 11 cycles. The scrubber towers were failing, slowly in a pattern only someone who lived inside the machinery would notice. and the cost of replacing them would have exposed 11 cycles of diverted concordate funds that had gone instead into Vashtorn's private holdings on the moon platforms. He did not need a competent technician. He needed a non-citizen with no standing, no fluency, and no allies who could be assigned to the failing systems, blamed for their failure when the failure finally came, and disposed of through the court's own procedures before anyone thought to ask why the master of internal climate had certified a dying lung as healthy. Daniel Reyes was not a technician to Vashtorn Te. He was a scapegoat with a pulse, and the only flaw in the plan was that the scapegoat had begun, without permission and without announcement, to fix things. The court did not know this yet. Daniel had been in the spire for 40 days, and for 40 days he had walked the maintenance shafts that the vial disdained because the shafts ran below the readable light, and a courtier who descended into them was effectively blinding himself. Daniel did not need the light. He read machinery the way the veil read the warming corridors, and what he read in the scrubber towers frightened him in a way the spire never had. The towers were not maintained. They were managed, which is a different thing, the way a man with a broken leg can be managed with painkillers until the moment he cannot walk at all. Someone had been cycling the failing units in a rotation designed to keep any single tower from collapsing while never repairing the underlying fault, and the rotation was tightening, and Daniel had done the arithmetic on a scrap of polymer with a grease pencil, and the arithmetic said the system had perhaps 200 days before the margin closed entirely, and the great lung began, slowly, and then all at once, to fail. He did not report this. He had no one to report it to. The chain of authority ran upward to the master of internal climate, and a non-citizen third-tier technician did not summon the master of internal climate. And so, Daniel did what working people have always done when the system above them is broken, and they have no power to fix the system. He fixed the part in front of him. He replaced a corroded harmonic baffle in Scrubber Tower 9 with a baffle he had fabricated himself from salvaged plate, working in the dark, asking no one, signing nothing. He did it because the baffle was broken, and he knew how to make it not broken, and he performed the repair as though maintaining the structural integrity of the spire's lung was simply an undeniable law of physics that applied to him regardless of his tier. And he did not know he was unraveling Vashtorn Te's entire architecture of survival. He thought he was patching a baffle. The child found him on the 41st day. The Val did not raise their young in the open court, which was understood by every species in the Concorda to be no place for the unfinished, and so the appearance of a juvenile in the lower maintenance gallery was a small irregularity that Daniel, who knew nothing of vial custom, failed entirely to register as remarkable. She was perhaps the equivalent of 6 human years, her filaments still short and uncertain, her skin cycling through colors she had not yet learned to control, flushing pink with curiosity, and then guttering to a shy gray, and then brightening again. She had wandered down from the upper galleries through a gap in the readable light into the dark where the technician worked, and she had watched him for a long time before she spoke. And she had watched him the way children watch competence, which is to say with total absorption and no judgment. Daniel was aware of her the way he was aware of everything, peripherally and completely, and he did not stop working, and he did not perform for her, and he did not shoo her away. He fitted the baffle, he sealed the housing, he checked the seal with the flat of his hand for the vibration that would mean a leak, and there was none, and he allowed himself the small private nod of a man whose work has held. The child's skin flushed a warm coral, and in the language of the Viel that the child had not yet learned to suppress, coral meant delight. Her name was Ilseven, and she was not supposed to be there, and she was the youngest living descendant of the luminous sovereign herself, and Daniel did not know any of those three things. He knew only that a small alien had been watching him work and had not run away, which, in his experience of the spire, made her the friendliest face he had encountered in 41 days. The child spoke to him in the trade pidgin that the lower court used with non-citizens, a flattened version of the harmonic language stripped of its luminous components, and she asked him what the broken thing had been, and Daniel told her. He did not condescend. He explained the baffle the way he would have explained it to an apprentice, in plain words, with his hands, showing her how the harmonic passed through the slats, and how a corroded slat fouled the pitch, and how a fouled pitch meant the lung breathed wrong, and the child listened with the ferocious attention of a creature being taken seriously for the first time, and her skin held its coral warmth the entire time, and somewhere 400 meters above them, the court continued to debate, in graded bands of light, the most efficient procedure for removing a human who had outlived his usefulness. Ilseven came back the next day, and the day after, and Daniel let her. He was not sentimental about it. He simply saw no reason to refuse the company of the one creature in the spire who treated him as a person rather than a problem, and he found, in the long dark hours, among the failing towers, that explaining the machinery to the child helped him think. She asked good questions. She did not yet know which questions were forbidden, and so she asked all of them, and several of her questions were ones Daniel had been avoiding asking himself. She asked why no one else came down to the towers. She asked why the master of internal climate signed papers about the lung, but had never, in her memory, descended to touch it. She asked why the towers smelled wrong, because the child could smell the failing scrubbers in a way the adult courtiers had trained themselves not to. And Daniel, who had assumed the wrongness was his own outsider's nose, felt the first cold edge of a much larger understanding settle into his chest. The child smelled it too. The child was telling the truth. The wrongness was real, and it was not his imagination, and someone above him knew. It was on the 9th day of their acquaintance, in the warm dark of the lower gallery, with the great lung pulsing its slow tidal harmonic through the stone around them, that Ilseven asked Daniel the question that the entire court would soon be unable to stop discussing. She had been quiet for a long while, watching him coil a length of conduit, her skin a soft, uncertain lavender, and when she spoke, her voice in the trade pidgin was small and direct, in the way of children who have decided something and are checking whether the universe will permit it. She asked him whether he was going to leave. She asked it plainly, without the elaborate hedging the court used for every transaction, and Daniel, who had been told 9 separate times by 9 separate functionaries that his provisional designation was under review, and that his continued presence was a matter for the court to decide, understood that the child was asking something the adults had been too frightened or too political to ask. He set down the conduit. He looked at her, at the small, uncertain creature who smelled the truth, and asked the forbidden questions, and he considered the honest answer, which was that he did not know, that his fate was a glyph being debated in light he could not read, that he was a scapegoat who had not yet learned he was a scapegoat. He did not say any of that. The child reached out the way children do and took his hand, her small, luminous fingers cool against his warm, working palm, the interspecies contrast of it stark in the dim gallery. Her skin and his skin, a study in temperature, and she asked him, holding his hand, whether he would stay. "Forever," she said, in the flat trade pidgin. Would he stay forever? Daniel Reyes had spent 49 days being treated as a temporary inconvenience by a court that intended to dispose of him, and he was a man who said what he meant and meant what he said, and he was holding the hand of the only person in the spire who had ever asked him to remain rather than waited for an excuse to remove him. He said yes. He said it simply, the way he sealed a housing, the way he checked a gauge, a thing stated plainly because it was true in the moment he said it. He did not know he was making a promise to the heir of the luminous Concordat. He thought he was reassuring a lonely child. The child's skin flared a coral so bright it lit the gallery, and she released his hand and ran, her short filaments streaming up through the gap in the readable light toward the galleries above. And Daniel returned to his conduit and thought no more about it. And he had no way of knowing that the small creature was carrying his single plain word upward through 400 meters of breathing stone toward the only individual in the spire whose curiosity could not be overruled by Vasseur and Tay. The court learned of it within the hour. The luminous sovereign of the Concordat was not a tyrant in the way the architecture of the spire might have suggested, but she was old, impatient, and very nearly impossible to surprise, and she had ruled for 300 cycles through the simple expedient of never acting on a thing until she understood it completely. Her name, in the portion of the harmonic language a human throat could approximate, was Sovereign Hail Morove, and she was the great-grandmother of the child Ilseven. And when the child came to her, flushed and luminous, and reported that the human in the lower towers had promised to stay forever, the sovereign did not laugh, and did not dismiss it, and did not punish the child for descending where she should not have gone. She asked questions. She was, fundamentally, a creature who asked questions, and her great-granddaughter had inherited the trait undiluted, and the questions the sovereign asked were these. Why was a non-citizen technician forming attachments in the lower galleries? Why had the child smelled wrongness in the lung? And why had the master of internal climate, who certified the lung as healthy, never in living memory descended to touch it? Vasseur and Tay, summoned to the high gallery to explain, made the single error that competent liars make when they have grown comfortable, which was to answer the question he expected rather than the question he was asked. He explained smoothly that the human was a scheduled disposal, that the provisional designation had always been temporary, that the court need not trouble itself with the sentimental confusions of a juvenile who had wandered where she ought not. He did not explain why the lung smelled wrong. He had not been asked in his own mind about the lung. He had been asked about the human, and he disposed of the human in 3 smooth sentences, and the sovereign, who had ruled for 300 cycles by noticing what was not said, noticed that the master of internal climate had answered a question about a child and ignored a question about air. The court's light, which had been a neutral graded teal, dimmed by a single band. Vashorin did not see it. He was looking at the sovereign. The rest of the court saw it, and the rest of the court understood, in the way the Vael understood everything, through the light, that the sovereign's approval had cooled by 1 degree, and that the cooling was aimed at the master of internal climate, and that something in the smooth disposal of the human had rung false in the oldest and most patient mind in the Concordat. Vasseur and Tay walked out of the high gallery believing he had secured the human's removal. He had in fact signed the first line of his own exposure, and he had done it by being asked, for the first time in 11 cycles, a question he had not prepared to answer. The sovereign did a thing that had not been done in 900 cycles. She announced in a pulsed glyph that propagated down through every readable band of light in the spire that she would descend. The luminous sovereign would go down into the lower galleries, below the readable light, into the dark where the lung was tended, and she would see the towers with her own luminous eyes. The court convulsed. A sovereign did not descend. The lower galleries were beneath the court in every sense, unreadable, unlit, the province of non-citizens and machinery, and for the sovereign to enter them was a violation of 900 cycles of architectural meaning. Vassorente, who could not openly object without explaining why he feared what the sovereign would find, was forced to accompany her, his thinned silver filaments held rigid, his cooled lavender skin betraying nothing, because he had not flushed honestly in decades. They descended together, the sovereign and her master of internal climate, and the small, bright child who had started it all, down through the warm, cool gradient into the dark. And they found Daniel Reyes exactly where the child had said he would be, in Scrubber Tower 9, his hands black with the residue of the failing system, fitting a second fabricated baffle into a housing that the certified integrity report swore was sound. He did not know who she was. The sovereign of the Concordat stood in the dark of the lower gallery, her luminance the only light, and Daniel Reyes glanced up from his work at the tall, glowing figure and the rigid silver elder beside her and the small coral child between them, and he registered the child first, because the child was the only one he knew, and he gave Ilsevin a small nod of greeting, the unhurried acknowledgement of a co-worker, and then he returned his attention to the baffle, because the baffle was not yet seated, and a half-seated baffle was worse than no baffle at all. The court, watching through relayed light from the galleries above, saw a non-citizen technician decline to abase himself before the luminous sovereign, and held its collective breath, and waited for the lethal correction. The correction did not come. The sovereign watched the human work. She was 300 cycles old, and she had been abased before by every creature she had ever met, and she had never once in 300 cycles watched someone simply continue working in her presence, because the work mattered more than her presence, and she found the experience clarifying in a way the entire architecture of her court had been designed to prevent. She asked him, in the trade pigeon, what he was doing. Daniel told her. He did not know he was speaking to the sovereign, and so he told her the truth in plain words, the way he had told the child, that the baffle was broken, that the lung was breathing wrong, that the towers were failing on a tightening rotation that someone had been managing rather than fixing, that the certified reports were lies, that the system had perhaps 190 days left before the margin closed and the spire began to suffocate. He said all of this to the tall, glowing stranger because the tall, glowing stranger had asked, and Daniel Reyes answered direct questions with direct answers, and beside the sovereign, the master of internal climate's cooled lavender skin did something it had not done in 11 cycles. It flushed. The flush was involuntary, a deep, guilty violet that bloomed across Vassorente's face and crown before he could suppress it, and every vial in the relaying light above saw it, and every vial in the spire understood in the instant and total way of a species that communicated through color that the master of internal climate had just been told a truth he already knew, and that his guilt had announced itself in the one language he could not lie in. The human could not read the flush. The human had no idea what he had done. He had simply answered a question, and the answer had turned the master of internal climate the color of his own corruption in front of the entire court. The sovereign read it. Of course she read it. She had ruled for 300 cycles by reading exactly this, and she turned her ancient luminous attention from the human to the elder beside her, and the light of the lower gallery, which had been the dim indigo of the unreadable dark, brightened around the sovereign to a hard interrogating white, and Vashtorente stood pinned in it, flushed violet, exposed by a ventilation technician who did not know he had done anything at all. Daniel seated the baffle. The seal held. He checked it with the flat of his hand, felt no vibration, and gave his small private nod, and only then did he notice that the dark gallery had gone bright, and that the three Vael were no longer looking at him, but at each other, and that something had shifted in the temperature of the room that had nothing to do with the lung. The crisis came 11 days later, and it came because Vashtorente, exposed and cornered and facing the collapse of 11 cycles of careful theft, made the decision that cornered men make, which was to accelerate the disaster he had spent 11 cycles delaying so that it would arrive before the investigation could. If the lung failed now, while the human was still designated the responsible technician, then the failure was the human's failure, and the diverted funds and the false reports would drown in the larger catastrophe of a suffocating spire, and a dead non-citizen made a convenient and permanent scapegoat. Vashorin still controlled the harmonic of the great lung. He could not repair the towers, but he could, with a single certified command that was within his lawful authority, right up until the moment of his removal, alter the master harmonic of the spire's breathing in a way that would overload the already failing scrubbers and collapse the rotation Daniel had been holding together by hand. He did it at the high tide, when the lung breathed deepest, and he did it from the high gallery, and the first sign anyone had that the master of internal climate had chosen to murder a building rather than face an audit was the sound, throughout 400 meters of Livingstone, of the harmonic going wrong. The Vael heard it as agony. The lung's harmonic was the heartbeat of their world, and when Vashorin twisted it, the entire court felt the wrongness in their bodies, a sour, grinding dissonance that propagated through the chitin and the silicate and the bone of every creature in the spire, and the readable light began to gutter and strobe as the systems that maintained it lost their reference frequency. The court panicked. 300 cycles of architecture, fluency, and graded light, and when the lung itself began to fail, the entire luminous civilization discovered that it had no idea how to breathe in the dark. They could read approval and disapproval. They could not read a pressure gauge. The one creature in the spire who could read a pressure gauge was 400 meters below them in the dark, and he had felt the harmonic go wrong through the flat of his hand on Tower 9, a full half beat before the sound reached the upper galleries, and he had already begun to move. Daniel Reyes did not panic. Panic was a luxury for people who did not understand the system, and Daniel understood the system better than anyone alive, including the man destroying it. He understood immediately what had happened, because he had spent 49 days mapping exactly how the lung could be made to fail, and he recognized a deliberate overload the way a doctor recognizes a poisoning, and he understood that he had perhaps minutes, not days, and he understood that the small bright child who had asked him to stay was somewhere in 400 meters of suffocating stone, along with 300 cycles of courtiers who could not read the one thing that would now keep them alive. He did the arithmetic in the dark. The scrubbers were collapsing in the tightening rotation he had been nursing, but The master harmonic was the thing killing them, and the master harmonic was controlled from the high gallery he could not reach, except that Daniel had spent 49 days in the maintenance shafts, and he knew something the master of internal climate had forgotten in 11 cycles of never descending to touch the lung he certified. The harmonic was set from the high gallery, but it was tuned from the towers, and the baffles Daniel had fabricated and fitted with his own hands. The corroded slats he had replaced one at a time over 49 days were not merely repairs. They were a parallel tuning array, built without intention, simply by a man fixing each broken part in front of him to the correct specification. And the correct specification was the specification the lung had been designed for 900 cycles ago, before 11 cycles of managed decline. Daniel had, without meaning to, been slowly rebuilding the lung's original harmonic from the bottom up, one baffle at a time, and the array was nearly complete. And it was below the readable light, where Vashorin Te had never thought to look. He worked in the dark with the sour dissonance grinding through the stone around him. He pressed the fabricated baffles into their final seats. He cracked the housing on Tower 9 and rerouted the harmonic feed through the parallel array. He applied the salvaged plate he had been saving for a repair he had not yet justified. He tapped the reference frequency into the array by hand, by ear, by the vibration in his palm, matching the pitch of 900 cycles ago against the agony Vashorin had set, and he stepped back. And for 3 excruciating seconds, the 2 harmonics fought through the body of the spire. The murder and the repair, the high gallery and the low. The repair won. The lung steadied, the sour dissonance resolved, note by note, back into the slow tidal harmonic that was the heartbeat of the Veil world. And 400 meters above, in the high gallery, the readable light stopped strobing and came up clean and steady. And 300 cycles of courtiers discovered that they could breathe, and that they had been saved, and that they did not know how, because the saving had happened in the dark below the readable light, where none of them had ever looked. The child knew Ilzaven had been in the high gallery when the harmonic went wrong, and she had felt the agony like every other Vol, and she had not panicked either, because she had spent 9 days watching a man who did not panic, and when the lung steadied, she alone in the high gallery understood where the steadiness had come from. And she turned to her great-grandmother, the sovereign, and her skin flared the brightest coral the court had ever seen on a juvenile, and she did not say anything, because she did not need to. The sovereign understood. The master of internal climate understood, and the understanding was the end of him, because the lung he had certified as healthy had nearly died at his own hand and had been saved by the non-citizen he had brought to the spire to blame, and there was no glyph smooth enough and no light graded fine enough to lie his way out of a building that breathed again only because the scapegoat had rebuilt it in the dark. Vashorin Te was removed from the high gallery before the high tide ebbed. The court did not execute him, because the Vael did not execute, but they did a thing that to a Vael was indistinguishable from death, which was to strip his office, freeze his moon platform holdings pending an accounting of 11 cycles of diverted funds, and revoke his fluency standing, which meant that the master of internal climate would live out his remaining cycles unable to read the graded light of the court he had betrayed, blind in the only sense that mattered to his species, a creature who had built his entire life on fluency, reduced to drowning in a language he could no longer parse. It was a colder punishment than killing him, and the sovereign chose it deliberately, and she chose it in a separate gallery, on a separate tide from the one in which she settled the matter of the human. Because the old sovereign understood, as she understood most things, that the exposure of corruption and the acceptance of an anomaly were two different events that did not belong in the same beat of light. The court did not give Daniel Reyes a speech. The vial did not give speeches, and Daniel would not have known what to do with one. What the court did instead, in the days after the lungs steadied, was quieter and, to anyone who understood the vial, far larger. The courtiers who had spent 49 days routing around the non-citizen in the lower galleries began one at a time to descend. They came down into the dark below the readable light, where they were blind, where their fluency meant nothing, and they came to the one creature who was not blind there, and they watched him work, and they asked him questions in the flat trade pidgin, and they did not abase themselves, and they did not loom. And the act of a luminous courtier voluntarily entering the unreadable dark to learn from a non-citizen was, in the architecture of meaning that governed the spire, a recalibration of 900 cycles. The combat cast officer who had drawn up the human's disposal order came down and learned the harmonic of the baffles. The keeper of the scrubber towers, who had managed the decline for 11 cycles on Vashorn's orders and hated himself for it, came down and confessed it to the human, and then stayed to help with the repair, and Daniel let him, because the work needed hands and the keeper's hands were good once they were pointed at fixing rather than managing. The lower gallery, which had been the blind province of non-citizens and machinery, became, without anyone declaring it, the place where the court came to see clearly. Daniel did not gloat. It did not occur to him to gloat. He had fixed the part in front of him, and then the next part, and then the lung. And now there were more hands to help, and a child who visited every day, and a tall old sovereign who descended on the high tides to ask him questions in plain words. And to a man who repaired ventilation systems for a living, this was simply the job going well, and he treated his own astonishing reversal of fortune the way he treated a seal that held, with a small private nod and no further comment. The sovereign asked him, on one of the high tides, why he had said yes to the child. She had wondered about it for many tides. She had ruled for 300 cycles, and she had never once been promised forever by anyone who was not transparently bargaining for something. And she could not understand why a man with no standing and no fluency and every reason to flee had told the heir of the Concordat that he would stay, plainly, for free, asking nothing. Daniel considered the question the way he considered a fault he had not yet diagnosed. He said that the child had asked. He said it as though that were the entire answer, which to him it was. The child had asked him to stay, and he had wanted to stay, and so he had said yes, and there was no machinery beneath it more complicated than that. No glyph, no graded light, no 11-cycle architecture of advantage. A small person had reached out in the dark and asked him not to leave, and he had told her the truth, and the truth had been yes. The sovereign was quiet for a long while after that, her ancient luminance steady in the dark gallery, and then she did a thing that the relayed light carried up to the entire court, and that the court would discuss for cycles to come. She extended her own luminous hand, cool and old and bright, toward the warm, working hand of the human, the same gesture her great-granddaughter had made in the same dark gallery 50-some days before. And she did not ask him anything, because she was not asking. She was answering, the interspecies contrast of it, the cool, ancient luminance against the warm, scarred palm, was the whole reversal of the spire rendered in a single touch And Daniel Reyes, who did not read light and did not know the weight of what the gesture meant to 900 cycles of veil custom, understood it anyway, because some languages do not require fluency, and he closed his warm hand around her cool one and held it, and the lung breathed its slow tidal harmonic around them in the dark. He stayed. He had said he would, and he was a man who meant what he said, and the provisional designation was quietly retired and never replaced with anything, because the court could not find a tear that fit a creature who had rebuilt their lung in the dark and been promised forever by their heir. And so they simply stopped trying to designate him, which was the most profound acceptance the bureaucratic vial were capable of. Ilseven grew, her filaments lengthened, and her skin learned to hold its colors, and she learned to read the graded light of the court she would one day rule, and she learned the harmonics and the glyphs and the 900 cycles of custom, and she also learned, in the lower galleries from a man with grease under his nails, how to read a pressure gauge and see to baffle and hear a lung breathing wrong. And she was, when she finally took the high gallery, many cycles later, the first sovereign of the Concordat, who could descend into the dark and not be blind. The court came to take this for granted. The lower gallery stayed lit now by choice. The readable light extended down into what had been the dark, and the towers were rebuilt to their original specification and certified honestly, and the lung breathed clean, and none of it was ever spoken of as remarkable, because the vial did not cheer, and Daniel did not gloat, and the sovereign did not make speeches. It simply became the way the spire was, on a low tide, in a later cycle, long after the matter had stopped being discussed. A young courtier, descending to the towers for the first time, found the human technician sealing a housing on a tower he had repaired so many times he no longer counted them, and beside him, handing him the tools before he asked for them, anticipating each one by the vibration of the work, was the small, bright descendant of the sovereign. No longer quite so small, her coral skin steady and sure in the lit gallery that had once been dark. The courtier watched them work. He did not understand all of what he was seeing, but he understood the part that mattered, which was that the human belonged here, in the breathing stone, in the warm, cool light, at the heart of the thing that had been built to break him, and that no one anymore could remember exactly when that had stopped being strange. The child passed her hand to the man, and the man took the tool from it without looking, and the seal held, and the lung breathed, and the light, which reached all the way down now, was warm.